In Python 3, there are very important differences between the notions of strings and bytes, and it's important to understand this distinction. A string in Python 3 is a sequence of Unicode characters, while bytes are a sequence of raw 8-bit values. And it's important to understand this because you can't just treat a string as if it were an array of ASCII bytes, right? So let's take a look at this in practice. So let's go ahead and open up strings start in the start folder in chapter 1. And I have a couple of variables defined, right? One's a sequence of hex values and the other one is a string, right? And then I print out each one to see what their values are. So let's go ahead and run this code. So I'm going to open the terminal and I'm going to go into start chapter 1 and I will run the strings start, right? Okay, when I run this, all right, you can see that the byte values happen to correspond, right, with ASCII uppercase letters. And here you can see the string and you see the little B in front of these letters right here. That indicates that it's a list of bytes. So it looks like they're both strings at the outset, but watch what happens when I try to combine them. So if I write something like this, print, S plus B, let's watch what happens. So I'm going to try to run this again and I get an error, right? It says type error, can only concatenate stir, not bytes to stir. Right? Because the print function expects a string. And even though those byte values happen to represent letters, I can't just treat it as a string. I first have to decode the bytes into a string, and then I can add the two. And I could do that using a built-in decode function. So if I do something like this, I'm going to do S2 equals, and I'm going to type b.decode, and I'm going to decode it using UTF-8. Okay. And then I'll be able to print S plus S2. And let me comment out the one that's not going to work. Now, I happen to know already that these bytes are in ASCII, which also just happens to correspond to UTF-8, so I can decode them directly. If I didn't already know that, I'd have to perform some detection logic to see what the encoding is, and that's a bit beyond the scope of this example. So now that I've combined the two, you can see now that it works, now that I've decoded it into a string. And I can also do the same thing with the bytes. Now, in that case, I would need to use the encode function, which takes a string and produces bytes out the other side. And it's the opposite of the decode function. All right, so let's go ahead and try that with the bytes. What I'm going to do is b2 equals, and I'm going to type s.encode. And I'm going to encode it into UTF-8. And then I'm going to print B plus B2. Okay, so let's try that. And sure enough, that works as well. All right, so the bytes are now being concatenated. Python provides a set of built-in encodings just for this purpose. So let's try to encode our string using UTF-32 to see the difference. So I'm going to write B3 equals, and then I'm going to encode the string. And this time I'm going to use UTF-32 instead of UTF-8. And then I'll print B3. And let's comment out these previous two just to get them out of the way. And I'll run this. And now you can see that the text has been encoded into UTF-32. Now, it's beyond the scope of this course to go into all the ways that text can be encoded and what each of these different encodings mean. To do so actually might take an entire course just by itself. What's important to realize here is that strings and bytes are not the same thing in your code, and you need to take care when you're operating on both of them and you're trying to combine them.